just before the baby's soft cries had suddenly turned once again into inconsolable screams. A November wind gathered out of nowhere and sent her husband's pile of recently raked leaves tumbling across their lawn. She watched these leaves rolling as she stood at the window of their bedroom, her arms folded and a cigarette dangling between her index and middle fingers. Her phone, angled up against the window, showed a live feed of the baby through a baby monitor. She watched the baby writhe around in its sleep, its arms and legs twitching like an insect's as she blew smoke through the slit of the cracked open window. The smoke streamed from her mouth into the opening, then spread into the outside air like a forgotten ghost. She looked out at the leaves and imagined the wind blowing piles of small bodies around, rubbery limbs flopping and falling everywhere. The baby's screams made her gasp, made her shoulders jump up to her ears, made her eyes squeeze shut and her cheeks tighten and rise up into something resembling a tight, forced smile. Something in her flashed, and she threw her ashtray through the window without thinking, sending glass spraying outward, before turning to trudge to the baby's room. The husband was downstairs in the kitchen just before the screams pierced the quiet of the house. He was chopping vegetables and losing himself in the rhythmic slicing of celery when the screams, high and sharp, poured from the air conditioning vent above his head. The suddenness of the baby's intense cries threw his rhythm off, and the knife effortlessly sliced his finger open. He sucked air through his clenched teeth, then muffled his mouth by pressing his lips to the wound. He imagined himself a vampire, draining the life and blood and everything that made him who he was from his own wound. He looked at the ceiling toward where he knew his child was as he did this. He paced the kitchen for a bit before throwing the knife into the sink. He grabbed a paper towel, then headed towards the stairwell, kicking the wall along the way. The two reached the doorway to the baby's room at the same time. The screams were like heat waves wafting through the crack of the door. "Your hand." He shrugged his shoulders and tucked the blood-stained paper towel in his pocket. He looked beyond her into their bedroom and spotted the large, jagged hole in their window. He looked at his wife. "You tired?" She blinked, slower than normal, shrugged her shoulders. He pushed the door open and walked in. She trailed just behind him. He immediately saw a pack of her cigarettes on the windowsill by the crib. "I thought you weren't going to smoke in here." She opened her mouth, but then saw his almost empty bottle of vodka on the floor beside the dresser. "Don't forget to recycle that." He looked around and spotted the bottle. He pursed his lips. She approached the baby, touching her hand to its fat, soft belly. Its flailing arms and kicking legs reminded her of a beetle on its back being crushed. She moved her hand up to its face and rubbed the back of her fingers against its cheek. It felt rubbery to her, and if it hadn't been crying the way it was, she might not have believed it was real. She moved her hands under its armpits and picked it up. Its legs kicked in thoughtless spasms. She bounced it, cooed to it, whispered to it, pleaded for it to be quiet. Its eyes met hers for a moment. Then the cries seemed to hit another octave. She handed it to him with a sigh, then walked back to the window, one hand on her hip and the other against her forehead. It was light in his arms. He always noticed this when he held it. Its cheeks were red in exertion, and its hands clenched and unclenched like claws, grasping at something invisible. Its mouth was cavernous, and as the screams poured out of its mouth, it seemed to him that the mouth was expanding until the screams were now the echoes of some deeply buried voice that was bouncing off the walls of a great, toothless cave. She appeared behind him suddenly and gingerly pushed a bottle into its mouth. It sucked for a second, and for that second, they relaxed. But then it knocked the bottle away with a wild swing of its arm, and its screams again filled the room. "Should we call the doctor again?" He placed it back in the crib, then shook his head. "Why? They're just going to say what they keep telling us." God. They both stood in front of the crib, watching it writhe and scream. He turned suddenly and headed down the hall. Her eyes widened. Where are you going? What are you doing? I'm going to wash my hands. Do I need permission? No, I just thought you were leaving or something. Why would I leave? She shrugged her shoulders. I don't know. If you did leave, though, I'd have to hunt you down and kill you. He laughed. You can't stop me from leaving. I'll leave right now if I want to. Not if I leave first. She had a hand on her hip, and her fingers were buried in the folds of her oversized Penn State sweatshirt. Her lips were pursed. He saw that her hip was sticking out, and he felt a slow tightening in the front of his jeans. He took a few steps towards her. You don't have the balls. She looked up at him as he said this. Her eyebrow was raised. She studied the stubble that painted the bottom half of his face, the dark circles that rounded his eyes. She felt a slow throbbing between her legs that warmed her and slowed her blinking. She bit her bottom lip, and her eyes fell, half-lidded. Watch me. She stepped around him and walked into the bedroom. He followed behind her. She didn't hear the screaming anymore. When she entered their bedroom, she pulled out a small, flowered suitcase and tossed it on the bed. She opened it with a fling of her wrist. There were already a couple pairs of folded shirts, some underwear, a pair of jeans or two inside. She turned and looked at him. Her hand stuck on her hip again. He smiled and walked to the bed, then bent down. He reached under the bed and pulled out a gym bag. He, too, tossed it onto the bed. Jeans and shirts fell out. He looked back at her. She walked to the dresser and yanked it open. She blindly grabbed handfuls of shirts, underwear, shorts, and jeans and began throwing them into her suitcase. He hurried beside her and began doing the same with his clothes. When his gym bag was full, he zipped it up and dropped it in front of the bedroom door. She zipped hers up and placed it in the hallway a little ahead of his. He grabbed his bag and walked through the hall and down the stairs with it. She followed behind him with hers. The two stood facing each other at the bottom of the stairs. Both had their mouths set in tight, determined lines. She grabbed her suitcase and walked through the living room, through the kitchen, and to the door leading to the garage. He followed behind her, then opened the door and stepped through. She turned the garage light on. He grabbed the car keys off the hook and pressed the unlock button. She pushed the garage door opener button. He opened the rear car door, threw his bag in, and closed it. She opened the rear door on the other side, slid her suitcase in, and closed it too. He opened the driver's door. She opened the passenger side door. He sat down. She sat down. He put the keys in the ignition. She pulled her seatbelt on. He looked at her, his fingers hovering in front of the dangling keys. You're really serious, aren't you? She opened her mouth, then narrowed her eyes slightly. Are you? He looked at her for a moment. Wow, you were serious, weren't you? She looked shocked and shook her head. Oh, fuck you. I was just seeing how far you were going. Bullshit. I can't believe you would actually abandon your own child. Don't even try that. You were the one getting ready to drive. You're sick. I was just testing you. He yanked the keys out of the ignition and got out of the car as he said this. She got out of the car and slammed the door shut. Who are you to test me? He stared at the dusty bicycle hanging on the garage wall. He randomly wondered how long it had been since he had touched it. I noticed that you already had clothes in your suitcase. Planning a trip? She stared at him intensely before answering. I could say the same about you. He walked through the door leading to the house and entered the kitchen. She followed behind him. She called his name. He ignored her. She grabbed a handful of his shirt and pushed him. He was at the bottom of the stairwell when he whirled around. Keep your hands off of me. I'm serious. Or what? Are you going to hit me? He clenched his jaw as tightly as he could. She looked up at him, her chin pointed up invitingly. He turned away from her and started walking up the stairs. She grabbed his shirt again and threw her fist into his back. He turned and caught her wrists. He held her against the banister. She yanked her fists back and forth. Let me go! Let me go! He let her go, held his hands up, the palms facing towards her. She pushed past him and stomped up the stairs. He hurried after her. Halfway up the stairs, he stopped. Stop, he said. Stop! Stop, goddammit! She stopped and looked down at him. Listen. She furrowed her brow and looked around. Listen. She looked around, then her eyes widened. They ran up the stairs at the same time. They slowed when they approached its room, and they leaned towards the door. Only the softest snoring could be heard. She quietly entered the room. He was right behind her. They stood there, listening, together. She leaned against him, her back to his chest. He reached his hands around her and rested his hands against her thighs. She inhaled deeply, turning slightly so that her shoulder was in his chest. She folded her arms and shut her eyes, lifted her head up so that her forehead rubbed against his beard stubble, and sighed deeply. His hands moved in small circles on the side and back of her thighs. When she turned, he moved his hand behind her, and he let it roam around her body. He could smell her shampoo, and there was the faint, distant lingering of cigarettes. The baby rolled over, then yawned, his eyes opening in lazy slits. When he spotted them standing in the doorway, it began to cry, and the cries stretched to howls, and the howls rose to screams. She began to cry. She pushed past the husband and hurried to their bedroom. He remained in the doorway, watching it writhe and scream. His eyes fell on the vodka bottle. He walked next to the crib and picked up the bottle, his hands wrapped around the glass neck. He held the bottle over his head. A trickle of liquid ran from the mouth of the bottle down his arm, into his shirt, and along his armpit, chest, and torso. He stood there a while, bottle raised upside down, watching it in the crib as it twisted and cried. In that way, he was like a statue, an agent looming over the crib, stone-like and emotionless. Outside, the wind howled through the shattered hole of the window made by her castaway ashtray. She stood in front of the window with her arms folded, as if bracing herself against the rushing air. She thought briefly of casting herself out through the window, of crashing through the glass and landing among the dead leaves on the lawn below. She imagined what her future obituary might look like, and she realized dimly that she didn't recognize the name on it. She saw a face above the unfamiliar name, but she didn't recognize the image of the smiling woman either. The wind whistled in through the broken window loudly as she struggled to recall herself. The wind was so loud that she no longer heard any screaming. Minutes later, she sensed her husband standing in the bedroom doorway, quiet, unmoving, and finished. She turned to look at him. "You're tired," she said. "Are you okay?" "I'm going to get our bags," he said, ignoring the question. He turned and left the room. She remained by the window for a moment, then felt compelled to follow him. They both headed down the stairs, out to the garage. The garage door had been left open, and the air from outside had made the garage frigid. Instead of opening the rear door, he opened the driver's door and sat down. She quietly followed his lead and slid into the passenger's seat. He gripped the wheel, staring ahead for a while. "Just for a minute," he said finally. He looked at her. She didn't say anything, only pulled her seatbelt on and buckled it. He fished the car keys out of his pocket and started the car. He pressed the garage door button once the car was out on the street. He drove off. She didn't know where he planned on going, and she suspected he didn't either. "How far are we going?" she asked after a while. "Not far." She pulled her phone out and turned on the baby monitor app. It was lying still on its stomach, not moving at all. Its face turned away from the camera, its arms splayed out wide. Their baby looked comfortable, motionless, in such a state of peace that its breath was imperceptible to the camera. She started to turn her phone to her husband to show him what their child truly looked like. She paused and looked up at him for a moment, then changed her mind and closed the app. She settled back in her seat, laid her head back, and shut her eyes. With the large seat enveloping her small body and the car gently rocking as it traveled down the road, she noted, lazily, that it felt like she was in a cradle.